Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream event on the 14th of June 2022. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics here. Great to have you on board tonight. Very important conversation, particularly in the context of the energy crisis, the financial crisis that's emerging, as well as the fallout from the recent elections here in Australia. And so we're going to touch on a bunch of things, including maybe bail-in and need for a bank to pay for infrastructure and a bunch of other things. So that'll be a very good conversation. Before I bring him in, let me just go through this just to say we don't provide financial or legal advice on the channel. We are moderating the stream. This is as at the 14th of June 2022 if you're watching in replay. And if you'd like to ask a question, use that Walk the World to get my attention. That's the best way to make sure that I see the question and direct it to Robbie. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that you can get your question top of the list by using Super Chat or indeed making a contribution to help us run the shows here. Anyway, without further ado, let's bring Robbie in. Robbie, hello, you there?
Hello, Martin. I am here.
Great to see you again. I hope it's not too cold down there in Melbourne. It's very cold here this evening. We've had a few cold days.
Oh, it's cold enough. No, we've had a very wintry start to winter. It hasn't let up since the 1st of June.
No, I know. It's been quite weird, actually. We had months and months of rain, and then it's gone dry and really cold. Now, for those who may not know you, Robbie, why don't you just give yourself a brief introduction so that people understand where you're coming from?
All right, I'm the Australian spokesman for the Chinese Communist Party.
That'll get the chat going.
Let's get that out of the way. No. That is absolutely not true, despite the never-ending slurs I get from Cookie Boy, whom I love dearly. So I'm the research director of the Citizens Party, and the Citizens Party. I can see that, Cookie Boy. If I read that out loud, he'd come running downstairs to do one. The Citizens Party is a 35-year-old political party in Australia. As you know, we have a focus on economic policy and a mission to undo the damage, the vandalism that's been reaped on our economy by neoliberalism, which was this, I think, a deliberate takedown of the basic functions of the government being able to provide services to the people and just do its job. Whatever you think of government, you can be an extreme libertarian or a total communist. Doesn't matter. We're going to have one. You should want it to be competent and be able to do whatever its job is, do it properly. That has been sabotaged over 40 years, and basic tools have been taken away. And some of those tools include tools like a national bank to play a role in the financial system, and even just a basic stability role. That was all taken away. And I think 40 years later, the verdict is in. It's been a disaster. We can talk about that. So our party has been focused very much on identifying where it went wrong and identifying the key institutions that need to be brought back, maybe in a modernised way to a degree, to address that. In the context of the real issue, which is that what we got as a financial system in this neoliberal era is totally bankrupt. And in Australia, it's been heading for a crash for 15 years. They've been able to put it off and put it off and put it off. But as I said in our show last week, Martin, when I talked about you, because I've spent the last week defending you and your record. But you're criticised for your predictions being wrong. But every time your predictions are wrong, the way they were wrong is because what you couldn't predict is they dropped interest rates. Yep. But now they're raising them, right? And that's the Achilles heel. And that makes everything we say, we believe, really, really urgent.
Yeah, no, it's very important. And Robbie, the latest market, this is basically saying 3.9% by the early part of the next year is what the market is now saying, nearly 4%, right? The cash rate. Now, if that's anything like true, then we have a huge problem ahead, because that is just shocking, given the amount of debt in the system, and that's going to hit households and businesses as well as the government.
I saw one analysis that an interest rate of 7%, a bank interest rate, which the cash rates at that level will easily have bank interest rates at 7% again. Nowadays is the equivalent of at least 17% back in the 80s.
Yeah, because loans are bigger, right?
Because loans are bigger,
yep.
much bigger.
Yep.
And less capacity in the economy, to be quite frank. So, and that's probably even an understatement. So that's the urgency. That's what's hanging over our head. But the thing is, Martin, I'll tell the viewers a story. Back in 2008, I wrote a press release for our party forecasting, which we'd been forecasting since 2005, that the property bubble, which was sort of a global thing, especially in the Anglo-speaking world, was headed for a crash. And we saw the signs building up in America, etc. And here in Australia, in that press release, I quoted JP Morgan Fujitsu Consulting forecasting 30, so I forget what it was, something like 30%, up to 30% defaults that year. I didn't know then what I was quoting you. That's who you were, JP Morgan Fujitsu Consulting.
Correct.
We were on the same page way back then. And this was in 2008. That's 14 years ago. You and I didn't get to talk till 2018. That's when we got to know each other. Why, but you could say we're both wrong. No, all that's happened is the interventions that the governments did, which were quite mind-blowing, has kicked the can down the road. And each time they've done it, they've made the inevitable problem worse. And we could be at that point now where you cannot kick the can down the road any further. And so the one bright spot in this picture is I think we could be fortunate we've got a brand new government, because this it's not set in stone yet what it can do or what it would intend to do. And if it has to deal with this first up and it's brewing, we, the people, if we focus on the solutions, may be able to have a say.
Yeah, and if you recall what the previous government was saying about the state of the economy, which was everything was beautiful and fine and, never had it so good, et cetera, right? I mean, that has completely now fallen apart, and the truth is breaking out all over. And whilst we have very low unemployment, there are reasons for that which are artificial in nature. We know that inflation is way higher, and in fact there was a local article down here in the Illawarra Mercury showing that staple food prices in the last 3 months have gone up 20%. And they looked at Coles and Woolies and a couple of others, right? In fact, the local market was 17%. That's a much more realistic view of what's really happening for basic staples. And of course, for those people on a more basic income, it's a huge proportion of their costs. So that's the sort of stuff. And then, of course, we've got the energy conundrum, which we'll get into a bit later, as well as the debt conundrum. But it might be just worth updating people. The ASX today ended down 3.55%. It opened at 5% down this morning, but that's a pretty horrendous drop, bearing in mind, of course, it wasn't open yesterday. And it's also worth knowing that the 10-year is now at 3.956, close on 4%. That's the 10-year Aussie bond, which is pretty amazing, right? Yep. And the 2-year is now at 3.298, right? 3.298. Those are huge moves up. So that's really a signal that rates are expected to go considerably higher, and partly because of the strong dollar, and also partly because of the weaker Aussie and our weaker economy. Exchange rates now below 70 US. Now those are very important moves, and just to sort of round out the story, the US 10-year is sitting at 3.3, so our 10-year is higher than the US one at the moment, which is quite interesting. And I will just highlight the fact that oil is still shooting away at 121.66. So this is, the only thing that's gone up is oil, basically. Gold's knocking around 1823. So gold isn't really behaving the way that you'd expect gold as a hedge against inflation to be working at the moment. And our friend Bitcoin, sitting currently at 22,351, which is down about 15% from what it was a couple of days ago. So the Bitcoin story is definitely there. So wherever you look, we can see that there are cracks forming. And the point that's worth making, Robbie, about this is that there's a real big liquidity problem building. So last Friday in the US, essentially the mortgage-backed securities, there was no bid. Right? Following the inflation number in the US. And we're seeing... this is exactly where we were in 2006-7. Right? So the script is sort of being replayed, but the difference now is that we've got this massively high inflation, this huge amount of debt, and essentially central banks stuck between pulling on the inflation lever and pulling on the liquidity lever, right? And Ian McFarlane said the other day, you've got to understand that the Reserve Bank can't stop lifting rates despite the fact it's going to hit marginal borrowers very hard. And I think that's probably right. Powell has said pretty much the same thing in the US. We've got to allow the markets to, come down because the markets probably are too high. And he's not going to stop simply because the markets are dropping.
Well, a big part of the inflation picture is the end result of what bought them this time since 2008. They just, they printed the money to buy time instead of dealing with the problem. And, there was a clear solution to deal with the problem, Martin, but it required overhauling the banks, forcing them to change their behavior. It required bringing in Glass-Steagall back, right, to separate the banks, commercial banks with deposits from this ocean of speculation, knowing that what you would be doing is causing all that speculation to crash. But that's the point. Let it crash, right? Because it was all, just inflated, fictitious values, toxic sludge in the financial system. But they didn't do that. Instead, they brought in bail-in as the catch-all for them to protect, to use households as buffers to protect the system, and printed all this money. Well, now we've got the results of that. So it's all, this is the part that I think people really need to get in their head here. This is all part of the same financial crash. This is 2008 was not another event 14 years ago. It's all part of the same picture, right? It's been on a slow burn ever since. And for Australia, the difference between us and countries like the United States and UK is we didn't have a property crash to burn out the fictitious values underpinning our property. We just had more and more dry tinder build up. And when it finally goes, our whole banking system's at risk in this country.
Yeah, and a couple of statistics there. The ABS came out today. The value of property as at March of residential property was 10 trillion, which is way higher than, if you compare it to GDP, than Japan before the crash in Japan, right? 30 years ago.
Now, and I want people to think about that, because I remember, so in the 80s, and anyone who was around then might remember this, but the one funny thing I remembered, Japan's property prices got so high that there used to be a comment going around Australia that the easiest way for Australia to pay its national debt would be to sell the Australian embassy in Tokyo, because it's a well-positioned embassy. That would make us enough. Japanese land values were so great, that would make us enough money we could sell our whole national debt in one fell swoop. So that's how high Japanese property prices were. Now, here's the thing. There's about 100 million people in Japan vying for a very small amount of land. We have 25 million people in Australia vying for a much greater amount of land. So the actual pressures, the physical pressures that may cause that may be a driver of property prices should be so much less. Yet we have reached that same statistic and probably marginally overtaken it. That's how much speculation is in our system.
Yep.
Those are unreal values. And of course, everyone knows what happened in Japan after that. Well, I think despite what happened to Japan in those years, it could fall back on the fact that it was still an incredibly productive economy. Its financial system got very sick for a decade, but it was still able to manufacture and do all those things it did. We don't have that. What do we have to fall back on? We're going to have to create it almost from scratch.
Yeah, and it's worth just replaying the script a little bit. As you say, 2008 was the global financial crisis. We had the mining boom before that. And essentially, it was deliberate policy by both the government and by the Reserve Bank to use the housing sector and households to try and support the economy, right? So that was the growth engine. They actually deliberately steered the economy in that direction, right? And then they took interest rates down. They throttled open lending standards to allow pretty much everyone with a pulse to get a mortgage. And that basically stoked the property market, allowed the banks to expand their balance sheet. They borrowed more overseas at very low rates, and off we go to the races. And that's why prices are where they are. We're way overpriced relative to income or GDP. The debt ratios are way off the scale as well. And that means that the average household has got a mortgage is 15% bigger than it was a year ago.
Yeah,
which is scary, right? So a lot of relatively new buyers. People are saying maybe 600,000 new buyers are now very much directly exposed because they bought very recently, right?
I knew it was a lot.
Yeah.
Well, that's even more than I thought.
Yeah, and it depends on how you count it. And of course, people have been a bit coy about precisely how many there are, but there's a lot of them, right? And that's why in my surveys, when I talk about households with the cash flow issues, as well as the inflation pressures and the cost of living pressures and the cost of fuel pressures, they got the debt pressures as well because the mortgages are just bigger, right? And that's why, as you discussed the other day on your channel, I would recommend folks, if you've not seen Robbie's very good Saturday night release, he actually did take on Kukulis very nicely, which was great to see, because Kukulis and I have a completely different view of the world. He thinks everything's fine and debt has never been cheaper and everything's perfect, right? I would say something rather different at the moment, given what I'm seeing in my surveys. And by the way, I did nearly 20 interviews last week with all sorts of media channels because people were trying to get their head around all of this stuff and trying to understand. But the point is that we've created this monster now, and this monster is now threatening the stability of the banking system, right? Because we've got so much debt. That debt is predicated on housing. So the question then becomes, are they really going to put the rates up? As I said earlier on, 3 to 4% is what they should be. By the way, classic economic theory says if you want to quell inflation, you need to have an interest rate higher than inflation.
Yeah.
Right? Well, that'll go nicely, won't it? So,
there's everyone's Christmases are going to come at once with that one. My God,
exactly.
But see, this is why I went hard on Kukulis, because not that he has a different view to you, but the fact that he attacked you like he did because you're on doing 20 interviews last week. Why were you, Martin North, doing 20 interviews last week? Because you're the only contrary voice, authoritative voice to the narrative that suddenly everyone was pumping out. I must have heard 50 times out of different mouths, households have buffers, households have buffers, households have buffers. And I'm paying attention to your reports from your survey, and don't misinterpret what these buffers mean. I mean, these people are living hand to mouth in order to create these buffers. Yeah. But when he attacked you, and quite viciously, which to me was the giveaway, because that's the way denial works. There's a form of denial where you have a nagging suspicion in the back of your mind that you may be wrong, but you can't bring yourself to admit it. So what you do is you shoot the messenger. And we've seen, I compared it in our release today, Martin, with what I fear could be happening here is a replay of, I remember after the 2008 crash in America and, reading all sorts of books and inside accounts of what happened, et cetera, it occurred to, one of the takeaways I had was all these decision makers in authority, they believed all their own bullshit about derivatives, because there's a whole body of theory about derivatives. But if I can just really simplify it, they're supposed to net out to zero. And these people were denying they represented any kind of systemic risk, despite long-term capital management. That, you know, on paper they're supposed to net out to zero, not represent any systemic risk. And then you read about, you know, I came up with an analogy for this net out to zero. It's if 5 people are at a restaurant and they split the bill and not everyone has cash, and so they figure out among themselves, well, I'll pay you and you pay me and all this kind of stuff, and you can do that. But a bank can have 5,000 counterparties, right? It all goes pear-shaped under those circumstances. But they were denying all these real world realities. The head of I think it was the head of Lehman Brothers or AIG. One of those famously said on one of those market, multiple phone hookup things where people are getting market updates. He said, "Oh, we don't see a scenario in which our credit default swaps will cost us anything." And next thing you know, the whole thing blew up in their faces, right? But it was the denial that when they've got this basket case in front of them called Lehman Brothers, which had $25 billion in liabilities and $150 billion in derivatives. And they thought, oh, well, okay, we've bailed out Fannie Mae, we've bailed out Freddie Mac, we've bailed out Bear Stearns, we're getting political heat from, we're the great American free market economy, we're getting political heat from that. We can't keep bailing it out. You know, they tried to get an internal Wall Street bailout. That didn't happen. So what did they do? Hello, John. No mercy for the debt sheet. We'll come back to that one. So what did they do? They said, okay, we'll let it go. And then straight away, that triggered the $150 billion in derivatives, which instantly triggered an even bigger pile of derivatives in AIG, and the world blew up, right? So they were ignoring a real risk that they shouldn't have ignored. And what we're seeing with the Reserve Bank at the moment is there's a real risk in front of them. They should want to know what your data says. They should want to know that, right? But they don't want to. And to me, it's like the guy on the Titanic who goes into the captain and says, "Listen, there's a few icebergs out there. We should slow down." No, we're the Titanic, we're unsinkable. Or the guy at Gallipoli who goes back down to the beach and says to the Pommy commanders, "This isn't going to work. We're going to get slaughtered here," right? No, he gets shot for insubordination. You know, that kind of scenario. This is when you're getting attacked like you're getting attacked. This is shoot the messenger stuff, and that's what makes me really, really worried, because in their hubris, and the difference between hubris and confidence is reality, right? In their hubris, that they're the masters of the universe when it comes to finance. They think they've got this all figured out. Their classical economic theory is saying, yeah, we've got to raise rates to crush inflation. They think, if I've got the scenario right, that we'll hit them hard this year with steep rate rises. It'll crush inflation, and we can go back to freer money next year. Some kind of scenario like this, where they're thinking of the economy like a machine, and they're going to crank up this lever and then pull it back. Well, they may not be able to pull it back if they have ignored fundamental reality, right? And this and this could be the big one. This could be every bit as big as 2008, but even bigger for Australia, right? Where there's no ability, we don't have the equivalent of a Fed that has a reserve currency and can call on that when it does a massive money printing operation. We will be in depression territory, and we're going to need some very, very definite actions to take place to get the economy and get the people of Australia through that.
Yeah, Sandy, you're right insofar that the portfolio of levers that we have here are somewhat limited. And frankly, whatever we do here, whatever the Fed does is going to have probably as major impact as what we do here, right? People don't understand, I think, how small a cork we are in this mighty ocean, right? And the mighty ocean is being very much driven by what the Fed does. So if the Fed goes on putting rates up, RBA will have to follow. And that's part of the problem. The other point, of course, is that our banks, and if you know, Wilson Tsai had this wonderful chart which showed the mix between lending for business and lending for household mortgages, right? And basically, if you go back 20 or 30 years, there was 2/3 of lending went to businesses, productive use, and 1/3 roughly went on house lending. That's completely reversed now. So basically, we have big building societies with 60 to 65% of their exposures to household lending, plus, of course, an additional chunk to construction. So if you put those two together, it's about 70% of all of the lending in the whole country is directly or indirectly associated with building, construction and mortgages, right? That shows you the risk that we're facing.
Whereas those banks in the UK and the United States that went under in 2008, none of them came close to that level of exposure to mortgages. It was in the 40s and maybe the high 40s percentages for some of them, right? And that was enough to bring them down. We are well into the 60s and 70s when you combine it with construction. Successive governments have totally vandalized our economy. We went from being a productive economy that had, I think at the beginning of the 80s, we still had over 20% of our economy was manufacturing. Right now it's less than 5%. And what we have is houses and holes. Right now, the holes earn us income for sure, but not the income that we could be earning if we weren't exporting raw materials, but we're exporting finished products. And the houses, this is the time bomb. And they did it to create the wealth effect, but it kept the economy going on debt. We weren't paying our way domestically or internationally, and so we've built up the biggest household debt and the biggest foreign debt in our history on an economy that you can't see where the debt's gone, except into these. You can see the housing construction, but you can't. These are not net improvements in the economy, and in fact, we don't have enough actual housing to be able to, provide affordable housing for people and that sort of thing. Right? It's all been one game, and that's been But also, people need to be really clear. This was quite clear in 2008, but Australians got to be clear on this. The product that has been in vogue in Australia is not houses. It's mortgages.
Yep.
That's the product. That's what everything has been geared at. That's what the banks have made their money out of. You are the ability for a bank to write a mortgage. That's the product.
You are the cash flow.
You are the cash flow, right? And the cash cow. Yeah. And the milking cow, right? And you're about to dry up. Yeah. So that's why we need political solutions, Martin. And but that probably brings us to, unless you got something else to say, that probably brings us to
let me make 2 points. The first point is average new mortgage taken out today is somewhere between 30 and 35 years in duration, right? Go back 20 years, the average mortgage was somewhere between 20 and 25 years of duration.
Whoa.
So the length of the mortgage has extended, right? Which means, of course, you're paying a lot more interest than previously, right? So the banks love you, right? And I wouldn't be surprised to see the 40 and 50-year mortgage. Of course, in Japan, they've got 50-year plus mortgages up there, right? For that same reason. So one of the ways they try and kid you that affordability is better is to extend the mortgage, right? The second thing they've done, of course, is to go the interest-only route. Yep. And it's funny how everybody is just fixating about repaying the interest bit, not the principal bit, right? Yep. But the amount of debt that people sit on into later life is a huge drag, especially if the property price rise that everybody sort of magically thinks is going on forever stops, right? And then the third point is that the lending standards have got so loose, and particularly on the cost side, that they still use these wacky ratios, right? Now, there was the Westpac Wagyu steak debate, right? Yeah. And ASIC basically lost the case there. So, the judge said, well, you can always give up eating steak. You can eat something less expensive. That's fine. Make capacity to pay your mortgage. But the point is that the banks don't know. The banks don't know precisely where households are in terms of their overall household situation because they don't ask the right questions, right? So, and the Royal Commission revealed that in spades, right? So you put all those things together and you just realise that we've got a mother of a problem, right? Which I think leads us to some policy discussions that we need to have. Firstly, of course, though, we should highlight the fact that if the banks are actually exposed and there's no Glass-Steagall, your bank deposits are potentially at risk as part of the structure of the bank, and the reconstruction of a bank through deposit bail-in is certainly a risk that people should be aware of. Now, we're not saying it's necessarily going to happen tomorrow afternoon, but there is a risk it could happen in Australia.
No, there is, and there's a reason that they brought in the legislation and worded it the way they did. Plus, our government, and actually it was the former Labor government when it happened, our government signed on to the Financial Stability Board's what's called key attributes of effective resolution regimes, and this was in 2011. The Financial Stability Board is part of the Bank for International Settlements. And so it was the Wayne Swan Julia Gillard government that signed on to that. And our government has been committed to it ever since. So, of course, in 2018, St. Valentine's Day, massacre of democracy, as we call it, or massacre of your deposits, they rammed the bail-in bill through. Now, it's worded, curiously, but the point is while they deny this will be used to bail in deposits, but then in our 2020 campaign around Senator Malcolm Roberts' bill, remember, Martin, where a lot of people came out of the woodwork and admitted, no, this is a danger of bailing in deposits, including a former banking association executive, and so there's enough ambiguity there that in an actual crisis, the way the regulators work, if they're not expressly forbidden from doing something, they will do whatever it takes to deal with that crisis. And whatever it takes has been mapped out in this global bail-in regime. And if it comes down to your deposits and saving those banks, and let me tell you something about the big four banks in Australia, which makes your deposits puts them at even more risk. The IMF itself says no Australian bank, no one Australian bank is a globally systemically important bank. There's about 30 identifiable globally systemically important banks, GSIBs, that each are capable of bringing down the global financial system itself, like a Lehman Brothers, right? And bail-in was actually invented to keep those banks propped up. So our big four, even though they dominate our economy, none of them are one of those banks. However, collectively, Australia's financial banking system is globally systemically important. Well, sorry about that. Let me just shut this up. When you realise that the business model of the big four are remarkably similar, slight variations, but remarkably similar, especially in their exposure to the property market, right? If there's a systemic crisis in one, there's likely going to be a systemic crisis in all of them, and they will be all at once a threat to the global financial system. And those are exactly the circumstances in which the Bank for International Settlements will tell the RBA and APRA in Australia, you better bail in your banks. And the line of authority over our financial system comes from the Bank for International Settlements. It doesn't come from Canberra. And now that the election's over, Martin, I can tell the story publicly.
Yep.
The first time I met John Alexander, who's now an ex-member of Parliament, he told me and Wilson Tsai, who I was with, about his concern. Now, John was a tennis star, remember? He one of these celebrities recruited to be a Liberal candidate. He was a sincere guy, and I thought it was great. I think John's great because he's not a career politician. So he had the crazy idea of getting into Parliament and trying to govern for Australia. And one of the things he looked at and became very concerned about was the property market.
Yep.
And after he conducted an inquiry, which his own government wouldn't let him write the final report on, They saw his draft and scrapped it, and they wrote it instead because they didn't want him to say there's a major problem in the property market, right? So this, John had that experience. But he went to the Treasurer, then Scott Morrison, and said, look at this property bubble. What are we going to do about it? And Morrison's immortal words to John Alexander were, that's not our responsibility, that's APRA's. And John was flabbergasted. He said, aren't we the government? What do you mean that's not our responsibility? Isn't everything our responsibility? But in Scott Morrison's mind, there was a division of labour, and he, the Treasurer, in charge of the Treasury, was not responsible for ultimately for the financial system. It was APRA, and we know APRA takes its orders from the Bank for International Settlements. So if the Bank for International Settlements says, hey, we do not like what's happening in your big four Australian banks, you're going under, but you're going to take us all down with you. You better prop those banks up, and you've got one trick: bail in, grab the deposits, keep the banks solvent. You better do it. Well, the law as written does not stop APRA from doing that. Right. So this is now when you think about the chronology, the 2011 deal that all the G20 countries and our government signed on to was 2 years before Cyprus. I knew nothing about bail-in until Cyprus. When Cyprus happened, the whole world was, huh? What? You're taking people's money to keep banks, I'm still shocked to this day that it happened, right? So it's 10 years next year that it happened. But that was the first indication that they'd come up with a new policy. And then, we've been fighting against it ever since. So now, though, we know about it. So now we've got a new government. They're going to be dealing with this crisis. We have to be fully aware that this is an issue, and we have to fight very hard to take it away from them as an issue. Now, I know the people in Parliament that are opposed to bail-in are fired up and ready to fight on this again. We will look for a way to get the bill introduced again. I'm sure Senator Malcolm Roberts, who's still in the Senate, will put up the bill, the anti-bail-in bill again, so we can close up that loophole. Part of the closing up the loophole is to make sure that your deposits are protected from this eventuality. The other part of it is cutting off that avenue of escape from the government, so they know, no, you can't cheat and take a shortcut and keep the banks propped up. You're going to have to deal with this crisis head on. You are going to have to fundamentally reform the financial system. You're going to have to say, look at it and say, what caused this? We have to solve what caused this. And that means forcing the banks to change their behaviour and changing our system of financial regulation in Australia. But that'll only happen if we, the public, really engage hard and put the pressure on to make sure the government does that, because otherwise their preferred option will be, the old high priest of finance approach, keep it all in-house, only we know what's going on, only we know what's best sort of thing, and do something behind the scenes that then they'll announce later. We can't let that happen, right? If we're going to go through a crisis, this better be an opportunity to reorganise the whole financial system. So that's got to be a number one priority going forward.
And just to be clear, there is a difference between deposit bail-in and the deposit insurance scheme, which sort of exists up to $250,000 per account per institution, although there's a few little foibles, like St George and Westpac's the same institution.
Yeah.
But the total amount of deposits that is outstanding is much bigger than the total amount that's actually been set aside. Well, there's nothing really set aside, but available. And if it's something like 20 billion per institution, isn't it? Is sort of the maximum that they've got. And it's not activated until actually the government decides to activate it. So,
and the government can only activate it after the institution's gone under. So
yes.
It can't apply to bail. It can't apply
Correct.
to protection against bail-in.
And that's the point I was going to make, that in fact, if they do the bail-in route, they don't need to actually do the deposit insurance route, which is itself not funded properly and which doesn't give full protection in any case. So this is a very important thing to understand. And, there are things that you can do to sort of spread the risk a little bit, keeping below the 250K, et cetera, et cetera. But this is something that, from a political action perspective, is high priority to fix up. And one of the reasons why we're having this conversation is we want to underscore again that this is a live issue.
It is. Back in 2014, sorry, not 2014, 1914, Martin, there was a global financial crisis then, and the epicenter was the City of London. Now, there was a fear that there was going to be a run on the banks. There was a run on the banks in London, and the only bank that stayed open was the London branch of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, which had been going for 2 years by then. That bank stayed open because it was strong, because it was a government-owned bank from Australia. And in Australia as well, same thing. There was a fear of a bank run here, and the governor of the Commonwealth Bank, Denison Miller, made an announcement that the Commonwealth Bank stood behind all the private banks. The Commonwealth Bank would guarantee their deposits.
Yep.
Now, they had to put that into practice, and the way they put it into practice was Miller had drilled his staff that they in those days everything was cash based, right? There could be no appearance of anything like a bank run. Which, by the way, today I was going through the Broadmeadow Shopping Centre, and I'm on a phone call with and my wife was walking with me, and she grabbed my arm and she said she's pointing at the National Australia Bank branch in there because there was a queue coming out the door, and it's been years since I've seen a queue at a bank anywhere, right? Because most of it's like this was a queue coming out of the door, and I'm thinking, hang on, is there a bank run I haven't seen yet? Yeah, Miller didn't want that in 1914, so he said to his staff, as soon as someone lines up outside, you grab them. What do you want? Give them their money straight away and get them going again. So there was no queues, right? And in doing that, no panic eventuated. Because no panic eventuated, the Commonwealth Bank didn't have to back that up. Now that was a smart, banking person backed up by a government bank, which was owned by the people of Australia. Keeping the financial system secure a century ago. We don't have what we've got now is a bluff, a real bluff by comparison, right? That's all the financial claims scheme is. And people have to educate themselves in these facts, because and part of the reason, Martin, is that there's a whole new heap of politicians in Canberra that need to be educated on this. They won't have a clue. And for a lot of them, because there's a bigger component than ever who are not in the major parties, probably the biggest component ever of politicians in Parliament House who are not in the major parties, they will be interested in these details. They will be inclined to want to do something about it, right? And we can draw attention to this and force the government to change the system. Because what's required? Well, a couple of things in terms of the banks. If you want Australian banks to be safe for depositors, you have to make sure their activities are safe. If Australian banks are allowed to gamble in derivatives and do all that other kind of speculation that is inherently risky, with your deposits, your deposits aren't going to be safe. Real banks should not be allowed to gamble in derivatives, right? That's why you need Glass-Steagall. The other thing you need is the public bank. You need a public bank like the Commonwealth Bank was, where the public have the option, well, okay, I don't like what the private banks are doing. I'm going to put my money in the public bank. Now, by doing that, that'll freak the private banks out and create positive pressure on them to change their behaviour. The other thing it'll do, it'll give you a place where your money fully is secure. In the last 15 years, when people have been saying to me, where do we put our money? Where do we put our money? I can't answer that question for them, right? And I'm not allowed to anyway, as you know, because can't give financial advice without a license. No. But I genuinely can't. There is no perfect place to put your money. There is. I might hint to them. I know people who will tell them. But in general, no. Look, it's not like that. But if we'd had a public bank all this time, right, that's owned by the government, that the government is bound to honour those deposits, which it will until it goes broke, and that's a really extreme thing when if Australian government ever goes broke, then probably your deposit's going to be the least of your worries. We'll be in a post-apocalyptic scenario at that point. But that's what can give a ballast to the financial system, a place where everyone has a chance to put their money safely, because it is fully guaranteed, not up to $250,000. It's fully guaranteed by the government. And we could have had that all along. And of course, that's what we propose to create with our postal bank. And just to reiterate, it'll do two things. It'll give you a safe place to put your money. But in doing that, the private banks will realize, if we don't change our behavior, we're going to lose all our customers to this safe option, especially in a financial crisis like now. And before governments even tell them what to do, they'll start to change their behavior.
Absolutely. And, that public bank can also invest money into businesses and help them to get the money that at the moment a lot of small businesses can't get from the commercial banks, because they're not interested unless you give, your house on the bottom line. And we know that there are a number of small businesses failing at the moment and losing their houses in the process. So the whole financial basis for the country needs to change, and this is how to solve that problem. Some people say, well, hang on a moment, is it really true that you can allow the public sector to run banking? Surely you should leave it to the markets. Well, we've left it to the markets the last 40 years, thanks to the neoliberal school of motoring, and look where we ended up, right? We need a different philosophy going forward.
Yeah, well, I'm laughing because in the history of Australia, the period when we haven't had government involved in banking has been the exception, not the rule.
Yep.
Right? We've been in the experimental period. We have been the experiment, because for 86 years, we had not just a public bank, we had a great public bank in the Commonwealth Bank. It was a very, very good one. And when it was allowed to live up to its full potential in World War II, it was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant what it was able to do in those circumstances. But even as a retail bank, on the 20th anniversary of the sale of the Commonwealth Bank in 2016, Martin, I tallied up the Commonwealth Bank's profits for 20 years. They added up to $100 billion in profit that it made in those 20 years of being in the private sector. It was sold, its total sale price was $7.6 billion in the 90s, over three tranches. So we sold it for $27.6 billion, and the next 20 years it made $100 billion. But guess what? If we had kept it in public hands, it wouldn't have made $100 billion. And so some people would say, see, that's because it wouldn't be as well managed. No, that $100 billion is value that would have stayed in the economy, in your pockets, not in its pockets.
Correct.
That's the difference.
Yeah. That's
what public institutions do. That's what public services do. The value stays with you, right? What we've got now, I mean, in the election campaign, because I was a Senate candidate, I had some well-meaning people send me a questionnaire about public housing and asking me if I would support this idea of a public housing future fund to fund public housing, where the government would put up a few $1 billion. That would have to be invested somewhere, probably in the New York Stock Exchange or whatever. And then the dividend would go to pay for public housing. What a crock, right? Just get your own bank, build the housing, have the asset yourself. That's a much more valuable thing than some financial value in a stock market that you call a future fund. The government owning assets in Australia that are providing services to the Australian people. That's what neoliberalism took away from us. It literally stole our national wealth away from us. And people have got to wise up to this. We've got to change the language, throw it all out. All the language we were taught in the last 40 years, it's all garbage. It's the emperor's got no clothes, right? Go back to what worked. We didn't get rid of these old systems because they didn't work. We got rid of them because they did work, because they were impinging on the private banks. And we created this video a few years ago where we showed this footage of Joe Hockey in early 2009, then the shadow treasurer in Parliament, and he gets up and pontificates in the House of Representatives, and he says, So this is early 2009, right? The financial crisis would have been less than 6 months old. He goes, and if there's one thing we've learned, Mr. Speaker, it is that government should not be involved in banking. I'm thinking, Joe, government hasn't been involved in banking for over a decade yet, moron. Right? Your wife has been running banking in Australia. You know, people, you clowns have been running it. And, you know, this is the mess that you've created. No. We've got to draw a line under all that and get back to something that works. And a public bank is a very, very important institution for actually doing that. Can you see a nice little graphic now?
Yeah.
But part of the thinking behind this graphic, Martin, was to take that lovely New Zealand Reserve Bank graphic of bail-in and invert it and create a positive alternative. Okay, so what we've done here, and I encourage people, if you're interested in supporting this campaign, you can get in touch with our office and order copies of this. This is something we're going to start producing tomorrow. So it's a 4-page flyer, and it'll be a key part of our campaign going forward, because our number one priority, well, there's we touched on bail-in already, but there's 3 policy areas that we want to really impact. Bail-in, the postal bank as the easiest and most achievable avenue for a public bank, and reforming financial regulation in Australia, including especially ASIC. But anyway, the postal bank's the key one because it's the positive solution. The other ones are cleaning up a mess, right? But this is the positive solution. This is actually saying creating an institution that can really start to change the way the Australian economy functions, right? So anyway, we point out here on the first page, this is a lovely graphic from the LPO group, because the licensed post offices who run 2,850 post offices around Australia as small businesses. This bold text here, this was their call during the election. They called on the government and Australia Post to establish a postal bank to service small and medium enterprises and help sustain the network and fund infrastructure. And every part of that formulation is excellent. It's very, very important. This is what we've envisaged a postal bank would do. So what we've got here is 7 benefits of a public post office bank. 1, guarantee financial services for all, i.e. unlike private banks which are closing their branches, yours will remain open. Guarantee all deposits. We've already talked about that. Number 2. 3, financial viability for Australia Post and licensed post offices. Combining postal and banking services will keep both viable for Australia, because both as an essential service, right? Because there is Australia Post is supposed to run as a commercial operation. It's a quasi privatization plot by the government. We've actually defeated the actual privatization plot, but you know, if they always look for excuses to cut Australia Post capacity. That's why postal services are already pretty bad now, right? That you wait longer than ever for your mail. This has been the death by 1,000 cuts at Australia Post, because it's been harder to maintain the network financially. Combining it with postal banking services will solve that. And postal services around the world have done the same thing. Number 4, ensure cash availability and cash payments. That is incredibly important. I got a I got a call today from an old guy who's become a good friend of mine, a good source of information about how the economy used to work in Australia. He was a TAFE teacher teaching machining, but he had a problem using cash to pay a Macquarie Bank service actually through a post office, and Macquarie Bank had said he could use cash, and then it turned out he couldn't. But he told me how in Cobargo down in the south coast of New South Wales there, after the bushfires, when everything was devastated, the government did step up to help households. But how did they do it? They gave them a cashless debit card, Martin. The problem is all the local shops and
really useful
stations said cash only. Yeah. Right? This is nuts. Whereas all they needed to do was put the money in their accounts, and they could have gone to the post office. Yep. Because Christine Holgate, when she was running Australia Post and created this deal with Bank at Post, made sure the post offices are a place that will always be available to have cash. and the post office a postal bank will go against the tide of the private banks who are trying to get rid of cash. It'll keep it. Number 5, it will lend to local small business and invest in local areas, and go back to that chart you mentioned of Wilson size, invert that again, right? We need to get 70% of lending back into business and small business, and it will do that. And it'll do it in a way that encourages local lending and local decision making, right? So that you can, it's you just need to have, if you had a system where instead of private banks cutting off whole areas of credit, especially in regional communities, they just cut them off. And of course, what that does is it denying them credit like that takes the lifeblood out of it. Money doesn't circulate as well. And if money doesn't circulate as well, the small businesses don't do as well. They shut down. Eventually the towns wither and die, etc. If you go back in there and you provide the credit for the things, make sure they're sensible loans, but just be prepared to do it. Don't be prepared to do it to make a maximum profit. You'll make a profit as a bank, but be prepared to do it for the sake of the community. You can get that lifeblood of money circulating again, and everyone benefits from that, right? Invest surplus deposits in national economic development. This is the potential for Australia. My friend who was a director of the ANZ Bank told me that when Kiwi Bank started, which is a postal bank in New Zealand in 2001, because ANZ is as much a New Zealand bank as an Australian bank, he said the board was flabbergasted at the sheer volume of deposits that Kiwi Bank attracted, right? And it would be, a lot of Australians would be happy to know that when they're putting their money in the postal bank for security, that bank is lending that out into major infrastructure projects that are benefiting the nation. Your money is going to develop the future of Australia, right? And that's what it can do. That's the Japan Post model, by the way, which was integral to Japan's post-war economic success. Number 7 is lift banking conduct standards, and this is just positive pressure. You have a public bank that the private banks are forced to compete with. They've got to lift their game, or they will. If they want to keep this model that Adele Ferguson documented, I thought, pretty well in her book Banking Bad, that was published at the end of the Banking Royal Commission, and it was basically the model that David Murray brought into the Commonwealth Bank, where before that, if I can simplify it, the banks made their money by helping you make your money. They would lend to you something that made you, buy your house or whatever. That was always a big part of it, but lending for business. And if you were successful, the bank was successful. The model that David Murray brought in, which was copied all around the world, and he copied it as well. Well, he didn't invent it, but it became everywhere in Australia, was suddenly you were a cash cow to be milked. And those were the days, if you remember, you'd go into the bank and you couldn't make a simple deposit or withdrawal without the teller trying to flog you something, right? Oh, do you want insurance? Do you want a mortgage? Do you want this? And that teller was under excruciating pressure to flog you that product that you didn't need. And of course, that led to the abuses that led to the Royal Commission. On the face of it, some of that has changed, but the essential model of seeing every bit of your economic activity as something the bank wants a slice of, right? That hasn't changed. And this is still the essence of the system. We've got to change that. And if they're going to treat you as something to be exploited and milked, and you have a public bank alternative, which will just provide bare banking services to you, right, without that motivation to try and maximize profits off you, you will go to that, and the banks will realize, well, if we're going to keep exploiting people, we're going to lose our customers. We're going to have to change our game. So that's the essence of it. But let me just jump forward to this. So this is those things I've just gone through are elaborated here. Lovely graphic of what we think can be done with this. But I just wanted to go through this briefly because people need to understand that you've heard the Citizens Party talking about this a lot in the last couple of years. But this is not our idea, and it's not that new an idea. But look at this rogues gallery of economists, some of whom this is in 2009. This is a fantastic story. In 2009, they called for a financial system inquiry. And of course, in 2014, we had one led by David Murray, the same David Murray. But Joshua Gans, John Quiggin, Christopher Joy, I mean, when would you ever expect them all on the same page, right? Never. But they put their name on a call for a financial system inquiry. And among the things they said it should look at was, quote, should citizens who feel unsure and unqualified to shop wisely in our financial markets be able to access basic savings, payments, and wealth management products that have been vouchsafed by governments as being safe and professionally managed? Example, why can't Australians invest with the Future Fund? In this regard, is there a role for a publicly owned entity akin to Kiwi Bank in New Zealand to offer essential services in Australia's finance sector? Now, they put that out in July 2009. A week later, the leader of the group, Joshua Gans, wrote this article, he said they couldn't believe the response. And even though that paragraph I read you was just one of the things they suggested in this, that a financial system inquiry should look at, that's what everyone was focused on, this idea of a people's bank. He said we didn't even use the term people's bank, but it hit a raw nerve because everyone was thinking at that point, 2009, because of what had just happened, hey, do we need a government bank? So in 2014, the Communications Workers Union called for a public bank. In 2015, these couple of guys from the Department of Finance at Melbourne University, Paul Kaufman and Karsten Morawski, made this proposal to the financial system inquiry. In 2020, the Labor Party affiliated think tank Per Capita published, this is an excellent report here that you can get from the Per Capita website, Postbank, Filling a Void, Securing Essential Services. The history part of that report is taken from our material because we've done so much original history work on this idea of a bank. And then I make the comment here that we've put forward legislation for a Commonwealth Postal Savings Bank. Since then, the Citizens Party has received direct feedback from senior politicians in the Labor Party, Liberal Party, National Party, the Greens, Katter's Australian Party, and One Nation that they support a postal bank. There's nothing that our party's been involved in pushing that's had this broad support, raw support, before we've even started. Well, this is a policy that is actually achievable. It will be an enormous fight with the private banks and their banking association. It'll be a war with them to do it. But I can tell you the people in these parties that have told me that they support this option are not nobodies. They are very significant, and I'm talking about the two major parties now, especially the current governing party. They are very significant entities in those parties. They're in Parliament right now. They have high-ranking positions in this government. They support a postal bank. It's just they won't lead on it, right? We have to lead on it, but we have to lead, but in a way that people should have confidence. Hey, this is something we'll be able to convince people to actually do. So one of our initiatives as a party, which we'll we haven't geared it up completely yet, but one of the things we'll be doing is reaching out, running our campaign for a postal bank in tandem with the campaign we're running to expose the banks shutting down their regional branches. There's 575 or 576 towns in Australia that had at least one bank branch that now have none, Martin, none at all, right? They've just been totally abandoned by the private banks. Yep. We'll be targeting all of them. We're going to be targeting every council around Australia to show them, hey, you can have, if this is something, if you get behind institutionally, call on the Commonwealth government to set up this institution. One, it'll help your town, it'll help your local economy, it will help you, the local council. It can be a source of revenue, not revenue, but credit lending for the local council, because poor old local councils, they've got more financial responsibilities than ever before and less money to meet those responsibilities. There's something like $50 billion in infrastructure that's local government owned infrastructure that's in poor or very poor condition. And we're talking about things like bridges that you don't want to be on one of these bridges that's in poor or very poor condition. If it collapses while you're on it, but the replacement cost is $50 billion. That's not in anyone's budget. This is the sort of thing that should be invested in by a public bank. This is the Commonwealth Bank in World War One made its name by making loans to local councils for essential infrastructure that was transformative back in those war years. And we need that kind of institution can do it again. So anyway, this is we've got some statistics in this graph, in this flyer, etc. So I'll just jump through some of the pages there. People are welcome to contact, if you want a copy of this, contact, like when I say a copy, if you want copies, if you want to get involved, order copies to help share to people. It'll explain the bare bones of it as I've just given it to you, and then lay the foundation for more discussion going forward. So this is going to be a very big focus for our party in this new parliament.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie. It was a long run, but very worthwhile. And the whole regional banking thing, the bank run by the people, for the people, of the people, very, very important. And like you say, it's a transformational strategy, which is why it's and a lot of people are supporting it, which is good. And by the way, the cash thing is really important too, right?
Yep.
We don't want to find that cash is swept away. There's more cash in circulation than ever, according to the latest statistics, funnily enough, and people need to have an access to cash and use cash, particularly when the power goes off. Now, there's a bunch of questions which I haven't thrown at you because you were on your long run, but I might just pick this one up. This is from Jason. If you were able to control the path from here, what would you do to traverse the way through it? We're heading into now and soften it for those who are likely to end up wrecked through it whilst bringing the system under control. Well, I think you've answered some of that, and thanks for the super chat to Jason as well. But we might just mention also the mortgage strategy as well, right? Because there are a lot of people who are perhaps struggling with mortgages. Before we do that, there was another super chat from earlier on, thank you for that, asking about whether you'd actually had any connections with the Teal party now there, and are you going to be talking to them as well as part of this?
Yeah, that was a Freudian slip. They're not a party, Martin. They're just the same colour.
Okay, well, smells like a party, looks like a party, is funded like a party.
That's right. Okay, not as such, but to be honest, I've got a fairly positive attitude towards them. So we will approach them with an open mind, and I think the thing with the Teals is they are very obligated to their local electorates. Actually, S. Padaval, who just put up Watch Ithaca on ABC iView, the Free Assange thing, that reminds me, one of the Teals, the one who defeated Josh Frydenberg here in Melbourne, in Kooyong, Monique Ryan, she's been incredibly outspoken about Julian Assange ever since she's got elected. So I regard that, personally as a positive. I might have the figure wrong, but I saw something like between them, the 5 or 6 successful Teals had something like 18,000 local volunteers for their campaigns. So that's an indication of just how much they are going to be dependent on feedback from their local electorates. So our party will be taking the approach of getting our message out to the local electorates, engaging the Teals through direct meetings if we can, but do the 1-2 combination of getting their own supporters to Hey, Martin, did you see that offer? George Kaiser.
Yeah, I've made a note.
All right, George, I'll make a phone call. Dear Pretty Patel. Okay. All right, I'm getting distracted by this. Okay, so yeah, we need to get the public in those electorates to give feedback to the Teals about this. Now, I will say this though, I got to know Christine Holgate when we ran our campaign to get an inquiry into Australia Post and what happened to her. And Christine Holgate is definitely a supporter of the post or bank. And in fact, on election night, she tweeted to the licensed post office group, "I hope you get your bank now." So I don't know any of the Teals, but I know Christine Holgate knows Allegra Spender, the one who won Wentworth and defeated Dave Sharma. So yeah, look, these are positive signs. But to go back to the first part or the first question, we have to get rid of caveat emptor when in terms of managing this crisis. So I made reference to something that I know you and John Adams also made reference to recently, Martin, on our show and in a release we put out today. You know, you refer to these 600,000, potentially 600,000 borrowers in the last few years who've signed up to mortgages. But, you know, one of the things that happened in the last few years is you had, I don't know if it was unprecedented, but it's quite extraordinary. You had the housing minister and the prime minister, but the housing minister was most explicit, Michael Sukkar, saying, "Get in and buy your home now. Get in the market now. It's going to go up. Interest rates are going to stay down." That's what he said in 2019, right? And yeah, you can take the view that yes, of course, everyone caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, is a great way to live your life, but it is not a good way to regulate a financial system or run a financial system because it lets the predators off the hook. And in this case, the predators were the banks and the government and the RBA that, you know, treated the public like sacrifices to Baal, right? To get the magic of the economy working. And they're going to turn around now, as the Ian Macfarlane, the former RBA governor, said the other day. He said, "Oh, marginal lenders are no reason for the government, for the Reserve Bank not to raise rates." Well, those marginal lenders are real people, right?
You mean marginal borrowers, I think.
Sorry, marginal borrowers. Yeah, so I got distracted. That comment from Socrates.
Yeah.
Please, yes, please. I'd love to see that, Socrates. Lindsay Tanner's response. That is. Please do provide that. That would be great. You can just email it to robert.barwick@gmail.com if you'd like to, right? Please, that I would definitely love to see that from 2009. So anyway, it was these marginal borrowers, we shouldn't worry about them in raising interest rates. Well, those are real households, but in this case, they were actually encouraged into the markets. So because this problem is going to be potentially so big that it's going to be very hard to differentiate, we think we need to revive a policy that was enacted in Australia in the Great Depression of a foreclosure moratorium. We should not allow the banks, when it turns on for them, where they say, okay, we've now got to cover our asses, we're going to foreclose on people, right, to keep our books healthy, and mass foreclose and evict all these hundreds of thousands of people onto the street. Remember, after the GFC in the United States, the very banks that got bailed out turned around and foreclosed on 12 million people. There was something like 9 million households, 12 million people were actually evicted. I keep pumping the movie 99 Homes. I thought it did a really good job in dramatising how this actually worked. We can't have this here. And to their credit, governments in Australia across the board, all state governments in the Great Depression, enacted a moratorium. So we need a moratorium. Now, I've been involved in quite intense discussion with economists who've been thinking about this, and people with certain levels of expertise in banking and finance, on what then needs to be done inside the banks to reorganize them. Now, the Americans have their chapter, what they call a Chapter 11, right? Bankruptcy protection. You take the institution, you protect it, and you reorganize it internally. And if it's solvent, it can keep going. If it's a basket case, you've got to let it go. But that's what needs to be done to our big four banks in Australia. we can use the capacity of the Reserve Bank, which is our national bank. It's one of the few central banks around the world that's actually owned by the government, and that's it. That's our Reserve Bank. The legal authority already exists with our government to tell the Reserve Bank to do this, and the Reserve Bank has the legal authority to tell the private banks what to do in this regard. And we're going to have to go through their mortgages and write down the values of those mortgages, make the banks eat a certain amount of the losses. Now, the borrower is not going to get off scot-free because they're going to lose the value of their home. We're not going to be able to save investment properties, right? It's not up to the government to do that. We're just talking about where it's the government's responsibility to stop a severe social dislocation, right? Intervene in that. And this is all premised on letting the market crash, actually letting it crash. It's got to crash. There is no solution, and I'm quite surprised that I've seen this being repeated more lately than I've ever seen acknowledged before, because psychologically it's a hard thing to own up to. There is no solution to housing affordability in Australia that does not involve house prices actually coming down. They've got to come down. And if you think, oh no, that's the end of the world because you're worth $1 million because that's the value of your house, it's all relative. You'll never see that money. You'll never realize that $1 million because if you sell it to realize it, then you've got to go and spend even more to buy somewhere else. Let all these values crash. Get housing down to. We need a sweet spot where the value of housing is once again 3 to 4 times income, and it can be afforded with interest rates that are normal. And maybe 5 to 8% or whatever. That normal. What should be considered normal interest rates? Interest rates that the borrower can afford and the investor can live off. Right. That kind of sweet spot. Then you're in the ballpark of a functioning financial system. And we're going to have. And the biggest problem there is the house prices. They've got to go. But it's no point them crashing unless you write down the debts as well. So we've written legislation for a foreclosure moratorium to give the Reserve Bank the power to do this, and we've been trying to spark the discussion publicly so that when it dawns on Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese that they've got a problem, they need to know that there's a lot of educated perspective out in the community that they're not going to let them get away with some sleight of hand to say, oh yeah, we've solved it, when all they've done is put a Band-Aid on it like last time, right? It's got to be solved properly. And so, this is the way to we're not talking about engineering a crash. We're saying the crash is going to happen anyway. We have to try and engineer the soft landing part. But there will be a lot of pain, including a lot of psychological pain that goes with it.
And of course, the key point there, Robbie, is that you've got this psychological wealth effect that you've had for the 20, 30, 40 years, right? And so on paper, people feel extremely affluent, and, a lot of people have made more theoretical money on the value of their price going up than they've ever did from working, right? That's a contamination from the neoliberal school of motoring, from the debt-driven economy. It's not real, it's illusory, right? And that's the problem. And a lot of people will find that really, really difficult to deal with. But if we're going to actually find a way forward and lay the foundations for a more secure society, a more economically responsible for society, these are some of the issues you've got to deal with.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that will be, you're going to have to manage this to a high degree of specificity. But the big part of it, in terms of the macro picture, is we're going to have to launch investments straight away, and that's why you need a public bank. Launch investments straight away in a major infrastructure program and in industries, so that while this housing bubble-centered economy crashes, and we let that crash, we are immediately launching or reviving the productive economy model that we should not have got rid of, to soak up the jobs, the labour, and keep the economy working that way. Keep money in circulation that way, but make so that the money that's in circulation is through productive investments. It's through people actually earning money. And with the public bank the retirees can invest their money in that public bank. They can put their deposits in that public bank. They can buy bonds in government infrastructure projects, that sort of thing. That can be, keep them actually, having an income coming in, right? While they're working out their transition as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Robbie. And there was a little bit of in the chat. I put up a post yesterday. Cookie Boy actually has provided me with some very great research on asking prices in Queensland and how they're going down. I actually made a show called the anti-spruiking show. Basically, I said this is the got to have a different story here, and this is part of this same story, right? You can't just reheat the old arguments, right? No, prices will never go down. Just borrow more. 8 times, 10 times, 12 times, 14 times. Just go on forever. Have 50-year loans, right? That's all absurd, right? We have to find a breakthrough approach which takes us to a different destination. Now, we're going to break a few pieces of China in the process, right? It's not going to be comfortable. But if we're really serious about wanting to tackle this, I guess the question I've got for you, Robbie, is can we do this in Australia if the rest of the world is still dancing to the old tune?
Well, the thing is, the answer to that, Martin, is the rest of the world is not dancing to the old tune. Now, the last time you and I spoke on a live stream, if you remember, it was a week before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, and remember, Cookie Boy talked us into doing a quick live stream. And of course, a lot's happened since then. But I want to point out one thing. One lesson to be drawn from this experience is our definition of what the rest of the world means is really wrong. Because we've had our governments, the American government, the Europeans, the rest of the world has condemned Russia. Do you know 75% of the world has not condemned Russia? There's a much bigger world out there that's not going along with a lot of things, strategic policy and economic policy, like we have. This neoliberal disease is very much anchored in the Anglosphere and in Europe, very much anchored in that. So one of the reasons there's global tensions right now is because the biggest economy in the world doesn't follow these rules. China doesn't follow the neoliberal model. And that's when the Americans scream about, China's a threat to the rules-based order. The real name is the our rules-based order. And this is the center of the rules-based order is the International Monetary Fund and World Bank order enforced by the US military. It's called the Washington Consensus. And they have dictated, they've gone along to countries that have got into debt and had to borrow from the IMF. And that's come with conditions. And the conditions are you must reform your economy, right, if you're going to take this debt. But what did reform their economy mean? They had to deregulate their financial systems and privatize everything. And so Wall Street and London corporations would come in and just buy everything up. And that's been the model of the world for decades and decades and decades. And now the rest of the world is turning away from that because the Chinese took a different path. But the path they took is the path that we used to do. That's what made us successful when we had the Commonwealth Bank. It's the path that made America successful in the decades after the Civil War in America, launched by Abraham Lincoln's investment in the Transcontinental Railway with public credit, the greenback, the growth and transformation of the American economy was the greatest in history. It was stunning, and it's only been beaten by one thing, and that's China in the last 30 years using the same essential model. Before China launched its economic program under Deng Xiaoping, he went around and looked at what was successful, right? And now things like Belt and Road that the Americans have demonized as a threat. It's only a threat to their world dominance of Wall Street over the world. Belt and Road is a program of public investment in infrastructure right around the world. And whatever you may think, whatever the people making comments now about preferring America over China, et cetera, you can prefer what you like. The Pacific Islands want to do deals with China. The African countries want to do deals with China. Most of the world wants to do deals with China. most of South America want to do deals with China because the models are there. One's successful, one's progressing, one's not. And so when you look at it that way, I think Australia should consider itself somewhat lucky. We already have the best trading relationship in the world with China. In its essence, it's very fraught because of what's happened in the last few years. But we've got a great trading relationship with China. We could be doing so much. We should know that while we are at risk from our financial relationship with America, our dependence on American capital markets, the banks that have got something like $400 billion on 90 days is tied up in the American capital markets, etc. And they can stop us through that mechanism. They can stop us from doing the things that we need to do in our country. The balance of that is that we have an actual trade relationship with China. That's what saved us in 2009. And if we became more independent in our outlook and our foreign policy, we could build on that to make sure that we become less reliant on the Anglo-American financial markets. And we can do these things that involve going against the neoliberal model. Because you've got to understand the neoliberal model was essentially dictated onto us anyway. We've done a lot in the last few months in our publication to document some really extraordinary things that happened in the Whitlam government. Because most people of a certain age will have opinions of the Whitlam government. But I'll remind people of something about the Whitlam government they might have forgotten. Gough Whitlam established a petroleum and minerals authority, and they legislated it through Parliament. And then there was a double dissolution, and the Liberals, after the double dissolution, used their power in the Senate to have that bill declared null and void on a technicality. So it never really got up. But the purpose of that Petroleum and Minerals Authority was to promote Australian ownership of our resources. That was the purpose of it. So we controlled our own resource in Australia. And the driving force was the guy who was your local member in your area, Martin, the great Rex Connor. He was the driving force for it. And guess who it enraged? Didn't enrage the Chinese. It enraged the United States and the United Kingdom, because they owned our resources. And up until that point, and ever since, the American ambassador to Australia was always one of these celebrities, like we just got now with Caroline Kennedy. When Whitlam was in power, they sent an ambassador down named Marshall Green, whose nickname was the coup master, because he'd been in South Korea when they had a coup in 61. He was in Indonesia when it had its coup in 65 and brought in Suharto. And he was in Canberra when the Whitlam government was toppled. And it's been well documented the role of the CIA and MI6 in overthrowing the Whitlam government. And they scandalised the loans, etc. But they shouldn't have had those loans. Rex Connor and Jim Cairns and Whitlam went to Wall Street to borrow money for this program. They wanted to borrow $4 billion. $4 billion. That doesn't seem a lot in today's money, but that doesn't seem a lot. But in today's money, it'd be 160 or whatever. It's 160 billion. And Wall Street and London refused to lend it to them. There was a capital strike on Australia, not because we couldn't afford it. They didn't like what we were going to do with it. We were going to get back control of Australian resources with that, right? So we could have some sovereign control over our own economy. And Rex Connor gave a speech in Parliament. He pointed out how ridiculous this refusal to lend this money was. He says this $4 billion is backed by $5.75 trillion in identifiable value of Australia's known mineral reserves. It's the best collateral anyone's ever had, but they wouldn't lend it for political reasons. And that whole thing ended in tears. But right now in Australia, there's 5 or 6 gas companies that are screwing us to death. They're doing to us what the British did to starve the Irish in the potato famine. Because if you know the story of the potato famine, there was no shortage of food in Ireland. There was just a shortage of potatoes because the poor Irish were only allowed to eat the potatoes. The British Army was in Ireland protecting these ships carrying pork and beef and wheat and all sorts of incredible crops to the United Kingdom, while the Irish starved to death, right? Because that food was grown under contract and sent overseas under contract. And that came first before the Irish even eating And we're doing the equivalent of that to ourselves with gas. It's our gas. We are the biggest gas exporter in the world. The same amount of gas that the Qataris, our only rival for the title of biggest exporter, the same amount of gas that they've made $26 billion in royalties from, we've made $800 million in royalties from. We're allowing these companies to rob us blind, and they don't pay any tax, and they're 80% foreign owned. 80%. This is criminal. It's insanity. Right? And we are doing, and guess what? They're not Chinese gas companies, people. They're American and British, the same people that Gough Whitlam was dealing with. This is why this is crazy. You've been taught the Murdoch media, Rupert Murdoch, who gave up his Australian citizenship to become an American and make money, tells you that China is a threat to you, while he represents the people that are ripping you off on a daily basis. And we've got more gas and electricity than we need. And right now, these days, right now, we are being told we're going to run out. They're going to turn off the gas on us. They're going to turn off the electricity on us. Wake up and smell the roses, people. Seriously. We need an independent outlook. And if we did, the things I'm talking about doing with our economy, we could do, because we could give the big middle finger to those guys and say, you've screwed us for too long. We're going to become independent of that. And it's the only way this country is going to survive. And if we did that, we'll be joining the majority of the world who are going in this path, while the English-speaking Anglosphere are flushing themselves down the toilet. Rant over.
Okay, Robin, thank you very much. Yes, a long run and a half, but some very important points there. And I think it's important to understand there is a different philosophical way of looking at the world to the one that we actually get presented in most of the mainstream media here in Australia, right? And that's really the point. There are other models, and you've got to ask yourself, has it worked over the last 30 years, right? Well, look, judging by where we are with the housing, judging by where we are with the power situation at the moment, judging by the tax take, whereby a larger proportion of the taxes is paid by households, whereas the bigger the profit is taken by those large organisations. Structurally, we have a set of significant issues, right? And if anybody thinks that this is something that, shouldn't be thought about, then I would say you're missing 90% of the problem, right? You can treat the symptoms around the edge. What you've just been speaking about for the last few moments is part of the structural discontinuity that we need to understand and then steer differently if we're going to actually get to where we want to get to. I think that's an important message for tonight, And the point is, there are things that we can do, but the first thing is to stand back and just think a little bit about, well, how things really are versus the way that they're sometimes presented.
Well, the reason that this economic question gets into the foreign policy and strategic questions is because the heart of power is economic power, Martin. And neoliberalism is not just an economic theory that people did for the hell of it. It served a purpose. It put our economy under the heel of a private economic power that is synonymous with the Anglosphere.
Yep.
And they took over the whole. It happened all. You were there. Thatcher in London, in the UK, Reagan in America, Keating here, Roger Douglas in New Zealand. It was across the board, all at once. And what? They all became geniuses at economics all at once? No. This was a carefully mapped out takeover of the world, and the rest. What I'm saying is a lot of the rest of the world has wised up. They've actually wised up, and right now there's this thing called the Eurasian Economic Union, which really represents most of the world, including Russia and China. And they're doing deals that they're basically designing a whole new financial system. And what the best outcome would be if we could, because you don't want a war, and war's always the worst outcome. We need to have a system where we get the big powers of the world, including the United States, to come down from the clouds, from the idea that thinks that it alone gets to dictate the future of the world. And the United States should sit down with China, Russia, and India, the big powers, Brazil, etc., and whatever they can agree to that works for them, because the way big powers work, it has to be able to work for them. Whatever they agree to that works for them, in principle, should be universal, should be pretty much workable for everybody, right? And a country like Australia, we've got a lot of potential here. We can realise, but there's a lot we can do because we still have the remnants of our developed economy, even though the skilled workforce is getting old and we're not that far from losing it. We could make a positive contribution to the world by offering, our knowledge and nous, and participate in programs to build infrastructure, raise people out of poverty, take away the tensions that lead to wars, reduce the tensions that lead to wars, etc.
Yeah, Robbie, absolutely. Well, thank you for that and for your participation this evening. We've run way over time, and there's a few questions I didn't get to, but none the worse for that. I think there's some very important messages there, and I guess that the point I want to leave us with tonight is that it's down to what individuals and communities do, right? So don't leave it to the politicians. Don't imagine that we can all sit back and let the politicians just do. We need to make sure that they understand what we want, because politicians are there ultimately to serve us.
Yeah.
Right. And what we've been quite successful with through the cash ban and through a couple of the other initiatives is to just turn the volume up so that politicians know that we're actually on their backs.
Yeah.
Right. And on some of these issues, there's going to be a really important program ahead where we'll have a chance to make sure that politicians understand that things like the different banking structure, things like dealing with some of the debt issues and other things too, are things we're going to take seriously, and we want them to think differently too. So that, in a way, is where I want to sort of get to this conversation tonight, to say it's not down to you, Robbie, or it's not down to, the politics alone. The community and individuals, we need to use our voices too to be able to actually steer the country somewhere different, because the past 30 years has actually not worked very successfully.
No. Stay engaged, and we'll keep publicising these specific initiatives as opportunities present themselves, and there'll be times when we'll say to people, "Come on, we need you to hit the phones, make phone calls, make submissions to Parliament, etc." Because we do have there's 16 crossbenchers, Martin, in the House of Representatives, in the new House of Representatives. That's incredible. Now, 4 of those are Greens, right, and 10, essentially 12 independents. Almost unprecedented, right? So great opportunity there. There will be a bigger crossbench in the Senate than ever. Great opportunity there. And you've never had a greater chance as a citizen to make your voice heard in the modern Australian political system.
Absolutely, Robbie. That's exactly right. So thank you very much tonight. And
thank you, Martin.
We'll put some links and things down below. I'm going to take you offline now. You can catch your breath and calm down.
Thanks,
but thank you. Really appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll be coming back and having further conversations in the weeks and months ahead, because there are some really important agenda issues ahead. See ya. So there you go, folks. That's very much it tonight. Just to say that next week we're going to be talking economics with Leith Van Onselen. And given everything that's happening with the housing market and the economy, that's going to be a very important conversation too. So mark your diaries for next week. That'll be a fascinating chat. And I should just make the point that our doggy friends are still sound asleep. They did get up and get a drink at one stage when Robbie was on his long run, but apart from that, they've been there all evening. And with that, I want to say thank you all very much. Thanks for spending some of your Tuesday evening with us. Thanks for the super chats, really appreciated. Thanks for all the questions and all of the really interesting discussions in the chat. And we'll see you next week for a live, and obviously catch up with our other shows during the week. And a shout out to Cookie Boy for his research. We're going to use some more of that research in some of the other shows we're going to do over the next few days. And Stripey Cat, chocolate chip is the answer to the question about my favourite biscuits. So there you go. Thanks for that. We'll see you next time. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.